Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Many of us are familiar with the notorious front page headline, Ford to City, Drop Dead. In the fall of 1975, that was how one newspaper described President Gerald Ford's refusal to offer a federal bailout to New York City, which faced default within days on hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. How did New York, such a vibrant place in the 50s and 60s, get into this sorry state? Who were the leading players in both creating the financial crisis and in rescuing the city from it? It's a hell of a story, told in riveting detail in the documentary Drop Dead City. And here to tell us about it are the film's directors, Peter Yost and Michael Rohatyn. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, why'd you make this film?
You know, we looked at the historical documentary record of New York City, and it's a rich library of films, many wonderful films. There was just nothing on this period. It's a period that I knew a lot about, and so we decided to take a stab at it. And I had been around my father and a group of his colleagues from that period who were trading war stories. And so we decided to kind of start by making just interviews with people to just see where it would lead us.
So you really had unusual personal entree into the story.
Yes, I did, yeah.
In the film, New York before the 70s is described as a city of opportunity. What do you mean by that?
All right. Well, I think it was sort of a beacon of hope to the world, the Statue of Liberty, all of that, the thriving cultures and economies that converged in New York, and New York's ability to absorb and, shape into a kind of an American tapestry. All of those cliches, I think, were totally accurate for New York City. And but as with many other cities in the country, by the 70s, because of a number of things, a recession, a general trend toward the emptying out of cities, New York really hit on very hard times in this period.
What were the reasons for the decline?
I think it was a perfect storm, as Michael was suggesting, of a number of factors. One, for example, was in the 50s or after World War II, New York was the largest manufacturing center in America. By the time that we're looking at, by the 70s, no longer. Things had moved out. Dozens, if not hundreds, of companies had relocated upstate. There was the so-called white flight, where people left the city for a number of reasons, for the suburbs or other places, reducing the tax base at the same time that you had a loss of jobs taking place and you had a general national and even international recession. So you had and there are a bunch of other factors as well. So it was really, if any of these things hadn't happened at that moment, it's quite possible New York could have skirted the problem.
Yeah.
But it was almost like a wave in the ocean that fed onto another wave and grew exponentially, and it just came crashing.
And people talk about the 70s. The Bronx was burning. I gather Brooklyn was burning too.
Absolutely, 100%. But one of the things, also to just add to what you're saying, one of the things that I think that motivated us to make this film is people know about the Bronx is burning. At least culturally, it's fascinating. It's an amazing story. They know about the blackout. They know about Son of Sam. All of these kind of second half of the 70s kind of things. But nobody had really told the story about the socioeconomic meltdown in 74, 75 that led to these issues. Why are the lights going out in New York City, literally and metaphorically? Much of it had to do with the story that we were telling.
And don't forget the graffiti covered subway cars.
Yep.
So Abe Beame becomes mayor in 1974 and discovers that the city's books are way off. By how much did he think it was off, and why didn't he and anybody else know about it?
Those are excellent questions. I think that he miscalculated by $4 billion. So
it's a lot of money in the 70s.
He thought it was 2. It turned out to be 6. The question of why didn't he know is the $10,000 question. He had been the controller of the city of New York. He had been in government in every kind of position for years. I think he was overwhelmed by it. The city's books were totally catastrophically badly managed. I don't think anyone knew how much money the city had flowing through it, how much it owed, when these various bonds were coming due, none of that. So arguably he should have known, probably was in the best position to have known, but given the fact that the city's books were being run like this kind of ridiculous they literally were just writing it down.
Yeah.
I don't know, we found him sympathetic in spite of the fact that everybody rightly kind of looked at him and said, what do you mean you didn't know?
And I think that was in a way, made possible by the post-war success. When things are going really well, if you're making tons of money at home, maybe you don't have to balance your checkbook.
Right.
Because you're a rich person.
Right.
And I think the tide went out and it exposed these bad habits.
So there was reckless accounting,
Yeah,
reckless accounting. But also, you talk about the sale of municipal bonds and how that,
right.
were they just printing bonds like?
Well, that was part of it, was that the way the underlying collateral under these municipal bonds was sketchier and sketchier. It's a strange setup with New York State. The city is a creature of the state. The city has to go to the state in order to levy its taxes. The borrowing for city spending had to be approved by Albany. And in Albany was Nelson Rockefeller, who, in a type that does not really exist anymore, was a big spending liberal Republican. And he regularly would sort of endorse any kind of borrowing argument that the city could bring, and covered it with these increasingly sort of far-fetched formulas, like tax anticipation bonds.
Yeah.
So you're going to levy a tax. You haven't decided on what it is yet, but we're going to borrow against that tax.
Right.
And the banks, as we've seen in other meltdowns, the banks, without really looking closely, sold those instruments, those bonds, to investors, other banks, and the story is kind of unraveled. And
yeah, I mean, you point out the banks were also at fault.
Yeah.
They were greedy. They went
Yeah.
to made a commission on the bonds, so they sold them.
There's a great Richard Ravitch, who many people in the city will know, who's no longer with us, but is in the film, and had a great line, I think, where he said, what people often forget is that for every bad borrower, there's a stupid lender.
Right.
And so I think there's plenty of blame to go around.
With the reckless accounting, it reminds me of, I guess, what Enron was doing. I guess it was called marketing. We anticipate
Right.
we may earn this, so we're going to.
I think that's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
I think it was very, very similar to that.
And I do think also the bonds were generally, quote unquote, supposed to be used historically for capital improvements. You're building a new stadium, a new tunnel, a new bridge, these sorts of things, and you lend against that, and then you have revenue coming in to offset that. I think they really got into trouble because they started to use these kind of increasingly arcane and flimsy economic instruments to support ongoing expenses like payroll.
Yeah.
And that can be a problem.
Yeah. So Beame goes to Albany to ask for help, and an independent state audit discovers a much bigger deficit than he thought. He tries to negotiate with the banks, but the banks
Freeze them out.
said, forget about it.
This is an example where this divine mechanism, the capital markets, that is supposed to price risk to some extraordinary degree, failed again. And when the banks became aware of it, which is peculiar because they should have known, they were they simply raised the borrowing costs on the city. And it fell that at that very moment, the new controller, Harrison Golden, found himself in conflict with the mayor over the books. Mm-hmm. And that made the banks even more reluctant to lend.
What did the city want the banks to do?
To lend them more money, to keep the cash flow going. They could not make their payroll the next month.
Yeah.
They were borrowing short term just to have the basic cash ability to manage their day-to-day operations.
And there's a remarkable scene in the movie where Harrison Golden, the comptroller, describes on a particular afternoon, they would once a week or whatever it was, make these bonds available for sale to the bankers, and they literally had a physical tin box. This is the 70s, pre-internet, not pre-computer, but pre-internet, of course. And people would physically come in and put their bids. The banks would come in and put their bids into that box. And whoever offered the most would win that bid. And the problem on this particular day is nobody came.
Nobody came in.
Nobody put anything in the box, and the city, and that really set off the whole story that we're telling in our film.
So Governor Hugh Carey's response is to set up Big Mac, whose real name was the Municipal Assistance Corporation, right? What was the premise of Big Mac? What was it supposed to do?
I think the Big Mac was basically an emergency governing body, unelected, appointed, that essentially took over emergency management of the city's fiscal affairs, which is a drastic thing, and continues to be controversial, as it should be. Like that shouldn't happen in a liberal society. But in this case, that's what happened. Hugh Carey was a rookie governor, came into office, I don't think at all prepared for what was happening. It actually began at the state level, and then it kind of degenerated, and then New York blew up. That was really a five-alarm fire. And he reached out to my father to help out, not anyone really knowing just what exactly the contours of the problem were. And kind of put it, what you do, you put a board together. Let's just look into it. And then, it became clear that the banks would not lend more to the city without some kind of guarantee of careful management. The unions had begun to mistrust each other and the city. And so when they were being asked to give backs and to negotiate some sort of like adjustments, they all needed somebody to kind of trust. And I would say that my father became that person.
Felix Rohatyn.
Right, yeah, right.
Right. Had to pull all of these fighting parties together to try to reach some kind of settlement. So once the size of the debt was discovered, what was the impact on city services?
It was quite drastic and explosive, and from a filmmaking standpoint, unfortunately, or fortunately, not from a human standpoint, from a filmmaking standpoint, that was a good thing, because in the film you see these effects and these cuts literally taking place on the streets of New York.
The garbage piling up.
The cops at one point, or a number of points, were having all kinds of actions to oppose layoffs. They laid off lots of cops, which they had never done before. They shut down the Brooklyn Bridge to protest this. As you mentioned, the garbage people went out on a wildcat strike. The teachers, led by Al Shanker, went out on strike. The drawbridge people put up the drawbridges. You name it.
They put up the bridges,
They put up the bridges to stop the traffic. So things small, large, and medium.
Yeah.
It was a mess. And
I don't know if you had pictures of this, but they imposed tuition on CUNY.
well, actually, I was about to say we left the perhaps the most devastating for last, which is Donna Shalala, who was then active on the MAC board and went on to be central at CUNY. Ended up being on the board and cutting what had been free tuition for all in the city, and literally said that was the hardest thing that she's ever done, and she's done a number of hard things. So that was a really strong, clear example of the devastation that these cuts caused.
And people have been lobbying for return to free tuition ever since then, but it's not going to happen.
Right.
So Mayor Beame goes before a congressional committee, asks for help in staving off millions of dollars default within days, and the response from Washington was?
Very negative. This was you know, when we're making this movie, when you're making any movie, you would love to have a villain. And we kept sort of thinking, well, maybe it's this or that. And we came across in the White House were Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were the central players in the Gerald Ford kind of brain trust. And they were Midwestern conservatives and were very unfriendly to New York. They hated Nelson Rockefeller. And they basically designed the New York, you know, kind of crisis to become an ideological kind of a teaching aid. And so...
Like you're paying too many welfare recipients.
Precisely.
And
Profligacy, the liberal experiment, the coastal elites, all of it really arguably starts here. In fact, something I find fascinating is that they for Gerald Ford's vice presidential, for the ticket for 1976, they drove out Nelson Rockefeller and went to Bob Dole from Kansas. So they are turning inward and basically allowing the coastal, you know, elites to be the enemy. And Beame walked into this and found a very unsympathetic reception in Congress. And from that came these very complicated negotiations to try to get federal aid and then federal guarantees for loans from the federal government to New York City.
so what would have happened if New York City went bankrupt?
Well, that's interesting. This is all hypothesis, right? And it did not happen. I think a case is made, a compelling case, that the whole banking system that was as it was in 2008 is carrying these debts. Many of the regional banks in the United States were heavily invested in New York City municipal bonds. So if the bonds were to become worthless or have to be renegotiated at some great discount, all of those banks were at risk. And as Peter Goldmark, who was the budget secretary in those days for the state of New York, says, you know, if no one lends to those banks, now the banking system is frozen, you have a nationwide collapse.
Right.
And America, even in those days, was the central, you know, player in a lot of the global financial.
So,
what
like,
might
not only is New York going down, but you're all going down.
Right.
Absolutely, but on the ground in the city, and again, nobody knows, so this is speculative, but we did have Richard Ravitch, who was very deeply involved in a number of these negotiations, say he also didn't know, but things such as selling Central Park were on the table.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, you know, you sell the bridges, you sell the assets.
Right.
You know.
And it would have
I mean, it was
gone
very
in,
far-fetched,
arguably the
which
city.
is what we didn't really.
Yeah, and
we didn't use it.
And the city
so,
might have gone into
Right.
receivership
Right.
probably,
Yeah.
and then who knows what would have happened, because Felix Rohatyn, Michael's father, to my mind was, and as we explore in the film, believed very strongly in government. He believed in the importance of social services. He believed in the city. And so the fact that he had these kind of powers that went beyond the electoral, as Michael said, could be very dangerous. As we're seeing today in our world, these appointed rich guys, it can backfire very easily. I think we were very lucky at that time that he was who he was and he believed what he believed in terms of not destroying government, but trying to reform it and make it work. Whatever, it was an imperfect process. People have arguably legitimate complaints about Mac or about decisions that might have been made or didn't make, and it did change the city. But I think ultimately his intent was a noble one, and I think the results speak for themselves.
So the final bailout deal, the state legislature raised New York City taxes by over $200 million. Mm-hmm. The city unions put up, what is it, $1.8 billion. Mm-hmm. The feds put up
2.5.
Okay, a line of credit. And
yeah, it was a very complicated, interconnected thing. And it was, you know, the White House basically dared New York State to raise taxes on upstate people. And upstate people are not always very sympathetic to New York City. So that was its own legislative kind of puzzle. and one in which Governor Carey did like an incredible job of working with, it was a Republican-led state house, and finding a way to get people to all understand, like, we're all in this. And so sacrifices have to be made here and there in a way that we hope is equitable. It never is. But, and that was the White House's last sort of gamble, was like, look, if you guys can raise taxes, then we'll put in, you know, we'll follow. But kind of betting that it would never happen.
So was Carey one of the heroes in this whole scenario? Who were the others? Were there other heroes?
Yeah, I think it depends how you look at it. It's such a complicated story. I think, to my mind, we have I think 35 or 40 people who participated at the time on camera for this film, the interviews that we shot, and it's really a composite ultimately. And the thread that runs through and unites them all, to my mind, and is really inspirational. I was like 5, 6, 7 years old when this all went down, so it was at the kind of the edge of my consciousness. But looking back at now as a middle-aged guy, I find it deeply inspiring, and what unites all of these people, whether they be labor folks or bankers or real estate people or teachers or garbage people or whomever they were in this film, they all have this kind of light in their eye about believing in the city and believing that what they're doing is part of a collective whole. And they all might have come at it from different perspectives, but they were willing ultimately to get in a room and hash it out, and flaws and all, reform the city and move forward, not destroy it entirely. And I think that's a lesson for today. And so to me, cheesy as it might sound, I feel like it's almost a collective hero. One can point to, Carey was amazing. The different folks in different ways did their jobs or didn't, but the spirit of New York, what these people embodied, and a public spirit believing that their work was about something bigger than themselves, to me is kind of the heroic thread.
In 1975, the city of New York was fundamentally bankrupt.
What we have had here is political ineptitude.
Why should there be faith in government? Government has let the people down.
They didn't have an accounting system.
Everybody had stuff in drawers. There were no books.
I'd like each of you to comment on what you feel have been the lasting impact on the city of what happened in 1975.
I think, like this whole story, it is complicated. I think a great deal was lost as a result of this. To my mind, this was a moment where the vision of FDR and the Great Society after that of Johnson, and the belief that a city could really offer something substantive
And take care of people.
and take care of people was being explored and being made real. You know, experiments with the universal health care, free tuition for all, et cetera, et cetera. You could go down the list, and that's what much of New York was aspiring towards before this. And this, again, was that tidal wave where, for a number of reasons we've already spoken about, that didn't seem to be possible anymore. And some of these reforms rolled back the tuition, for example, that even generations later, people still clamor for that in many quarters, and it doesn't seem quote unquote possible. Why not, right? There's been a shift in priorities and our understanding of what a government owes its people, for better or for worse, I think, downstream from this event. So I think that's massive. But there's also, on the other hand, the budget has been balanced for decades. The city is much better run. There are, in many ways, for certain people, it's a better, more clean place to live. For others, the inequity exists. So I think it's complicated.
Michael?
I think that's very well said. I think the city continues to be an extraordinary place, full of promise. It's an enormously complicated place. The budget of the city of New York is $110 billion a year. That is not a sort of an elected politician's, territory. This is extremely complicated stuff. And everybody has to play to the top of their game. I think in those days, it was a place where to be in a labor union was a great thing. And the labor unions really were the ones, from, I think, what we've learned, were really doing what you're supposed to do, which is to work very hard, and to work very hard for your community and your constituency. And a lot of the other elements of the city let that down. So I don't know, you know, we had Chuck Schumer come and see the film, and we went and talked to him afterwards, and he said, I liked it, but you're hard on the city. And we do end our film on a note of sort of equivocal. The city did lose something. And I, as I said, am nostalgic for that time that I sometimes don't see so much around now. A kind of an identity to New York City that's very diverse. The voices, I mean, the film is filled with accents and, you know, and a sense of who you are that's very plain and direct. Anyway, so, but we love New York, and so.
Well, your film tells a very complicated story. I found it very riveting.
Thank you.
Watched it twice. And it's had a sort of happy ending.
Yeah.
Could have been worse.
Absolutely right.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'd like to thank Peter Yost and Michael Rohatyn, the directors of Drop Dead City, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 1-to-1 CUNY TV, and you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For 1-to-1 and CUNY TV, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.